Hi friends. Okay, today we are going to be learning about what is the weft, the warp and the grain of fabric. So we're learning this because it's really important to know about fabric direction. And we're going to be able to place our patterns properly on our fabric if we know what direction our fabric is running, and we're going to have a nice stable piece of fabric to work with. So let's talk about what is the grain of fabric. So the grain is the direction of the threads or yarns that make up the fabric. So to understand grain, we need to take a closer look at how fabric is constructed. If you look closely at a square of fabric, you can actually see the yarns that make up the fabric. You see that there? And this way as well. So they're frayed a bit and we can see the yarns. Okay, so we can call the yarns the warp and the weft. So let's have a look. The weft, one way to remember this, here's our selvage. The weft runs from selvage to selvage, from left to right. So weft, left, that might help you remember it. That's the weft. The warp runs along with the selvage. Okay, so parallel to the selvage is the warp, running up and down. So let's have a look at another piece of fabric. Here's our selvage. So we know that if we line up our selvage, the weft is going to go from one side to the other selvage. That is the weft of the fabric. So all the little yarns, all the little threads that make up the fabric, the ones that run this way are the weft yarns. The ones that are running up and down, parallel to the selvage, up and down, they are the warp threads or the warp yarns. Okay, so we know that the threads running across the selvage, so going from one selvage to the other, are the weft threads. And we know that the threads that are running parallel to the selvage, so up and down, they are the warp threads. So now we need to have a look at what this means for grain lines. Okay, so there are 3 grain lines to fabric. So our straight grain, our crosswise grain, and our bias grain. So the straight grain is the grain that runs parallel to the selvage edge. So the straight grain is the warp threads. Then there's the crosswise grain, and the crosswise grain runs from selvage edge to selvage edge, crossing over the warp threads. So the crosswise grain is the weft threads. And the third grain line we're learning about is the bias grain, and it runs at a 45-degree angle straight across the fabric. And the bias line actually has a bit of stretch because it pulls on the warp and weft threads. Okay, so let's have a look at this piece of paper here. I've got some imaginary fabric on this paper, and I've got an actual piece of fabric here. There we go. Okay, so let's see if we can work out what everything is on our fabric. So on the fabric, we've got these 2 thickened bits on either side of the fabric. That is called the selvage. Then we've got a line that's running from one selvage to the other selvage, from one selvage to the other selvage. And that is the weft threads, and it's also the cross grain. So it's the weft threads and it's the cross grain line. Then we've got another arrow that is running parallel to the selvage, up and down. There's our selvage, parallel to the selvage, up and down. That is the warp threads, or it's the straight grain going up and down. Then I have an arrow going at a 45-degree angle across the side. So it's a 45-degree angle running up to the other selvage across the fabric, and that is the bias grain line. So there you have it. That is how our fabric is made up, and they are the technical terms that we need to know. It helps us when we're placing our patterns on our fabric when we're about to start a project.